Module 1, our second sticky note lecture of this beautiful summer. I hope everybody's having a good summer. All right, so here we go. We're going to jump right into it. So, you learned a little bit about what environmental science is during Module 0. Today, we're going to start in with some actual topic knowledge. So, here we go. Module 1, Introduction to Ecosystems. So, right at the get-go here, we see a lot of definitions thrown at us. We're going to learn about what a community is. We're going to look at what symbiosis is. Some of these terms probably do look familiar to you because they were both in biology and environmental science if you took it. So if you look, biotic, anytime that this word is used, it always is in reference to something that is living. Abiotic is something that is non-living. And so a little bit later in this chapter, we will talk about the different types of symbiosis. And just know that symbiosis is a specific term used to describe a close relationship and interaction between species or different species. And it could be a positive interaction, it could be negative, there could be neutral outcomes. So we'll look at all of those examples. So when we look at an ecosystem, a lot of them have definite boundaries. However, there are some that there's no clear beginning and end. Great example of a boundary that does have identifiable clear beginnings and endings would be like a cave, so where a bat lives, because there's obviously 2 points. However, in a national park, it might be more subjective because there's no necessarily clear beginning and end between one organism's area and another. And then another smaller example of an ecosystem, if we think about this, so we're kind of giving a bunch of different examples. You might not have even thought about this, but if you think about a fallen tree and then you think about a little hole that's in the tree, there could be a bunch of different organisms living within that particular small ecosystem. And the boundaries for that might not be as clear as they are with the first example that was given. So anytime that biosphere is used, it means that we're talking about the living portion of planet Earth. And really our course, for the most part, is going to be covered. This is going to be talking about this area. However, we will talk a little bit about the atmosphere and portions where life might not necessarily potentially be able to thrive. So now we get into one of our next definitions. So if we look, competition. So competition, if you think about it in just the general sense, I'm sure we've all had some type of competition in our life, whether it's sports related, whether it's some other activity, or even, obviously in school, different competitions. But competition in this case can occur within or between species in an ecosystem where there are limited resources. And so remember that anytime there's a resource, so it could be food, it could be water, shelter, it could be mates, these are all considered to be a resource, and they're all competing for a limiting resource. Great example, if you look at these 3 charts, this was a great example showing that, if 2 species of Paramecium, on their own, they thrive. But once they are, trying to share the same resources, then you can see that not both of them will be as successful. And so this experiment right here just looked at how 2 species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. And so then that brings into question, like, how do animals of all shapes and sizes, how do they actually exist then? Well, we have something called resource partitioning, and there's a few examples if you read along about examples of this. So there could be, maybe there's different times a day that animals are eating. Maybe there's different levels within the soil that animals are getting water from. And so if you look, resource partitioning is using the resources in different ways, places, or at different times. And this can actually reduce the negative impact of competition on survival. And so if you look at this awesome picture, you could see that it's showing species 1, species 2, and you can see that, there's always going to probably be a stronger competitor, and they will obviously win in that competition. So what better way is to kind of resource partition that particular whatever they're going for. And so two species can evolve to reduce the overlap and thereby partition their use of limiting resources. And so if you look at this chart, or if you looked at any of the charts, You'll see that there's the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, and then you can see that we have the y, and in this case you can see that the y is number of individuals, the x-axis happens to be seed size, and so there's that small area of overlap where we see that they're both competing for that same seed size, and so maybe they're going to use some type of evolutionary mechanism to pretty much limit their reliance on the seed size. So you can see that the species in yellow is going to rely then on a larger seed size, while species blue is going to rely more on the medium-sized ones. And so reading this chart, that x-axis, we want to always think about that as the thing that is being manipulated or controlled by the scientist. That's the independent variable. And the y-axis is pretty much your outcome or your results. So that kind of depends on the experiment and what you're changing. So always think independent variable is the one that you change as a scientist, and the y-axis is pretty much your measurements. So then we move into, another great example, if you remember the Galapagos Islands, so morphological resource partitioning. So if you think about the actual different types of beak sizes, allowed them to pretty much access different types of food. And if you read along there, there's some really great examples, but all of these are pretty much set in place, so that way they're not always going for the same resource at the same time, and there's less competition. So then we're going to move into interactions involving one species consuming another. And so these examples include predation, parasitism, and herbivory. So predation, or the predator-prey relationship, is a situation where the predator is an organism that eats another organism, the prey. So this is, you've seen this all along. You probably learned about this back in elementary school. It's one of the, foundational pieces throughout science. And so prey actually, a lot of them have different mechanisms that help them defend off their predators. And so a great example, if you look at this picture right here, is you can see the porcupine. So obviously they have their quills. And if you think about skunks, they have that defense mechanism. So there's a lot of different things. Camouflage is another example. And so these would be examples of defenses that prey could use to potentially help fend off their predators. And another great example, if you look at this picture, they look like the exact same frog, however, they're not. One has pretty much formed this type of camouflage that makes it look like a poison dart frog, but in essence, it's actually not poisonous at all. So so mimicry is another example. So then we move into parasitism, and so when you think about this, you want to think that one organism is benefiting, the other is harmed. A great example would be like a tapeworm, and so that tapeworm pretty much uses the host's nutrients to pretty much thrive. If we look at the next type of symbiotic relationship, we move into mutualism. Best example, if you've ever seen Finding Nemo, which if you haven't, we are going to watch it at the end of the year. Yay for that after AP exams. But both species benefits. So clownfish, the sea anemone, they're both benefiting from that relationship. So they give some other examples in these pictures right here. Photosynthesis is like another really great example with pretty much coral and the organisms that live in that. All right, then we move into the last type of symbiotic relationship, which is commensalism. One species benefits while the other is neither harmed nor benefits. And so this would be kind of like an example where, the one species is getting something out of the relationship, but the other one is, not harmed or anything like that. And so that kind of sums up this chapter. So really we talked about symbiotic relationships, predator to prey, competition between species. The last little section here does mention another type of interaction, and it represents something called a novel species. So invasive species are an example of this. So I'm sure we've all seen the lanternflies. There are actually less of them, I feel like, this summer, but the lanternflies, nonetheless, are an example of an invasive species. Kudzu is another example. You've probably seen it, didn't even know it was there. But pretty much an invasive species is a non-native or exotic species that pretty much has become invasive because it threatens the economy, the environment, and or human health. And so if it checks any of those boxes, it is considered invasive. We will spend an entire like little section talking about exotic species, invasive species, and non-native species, because there are species that are brought to places that really don't cause any problems, but they're few and far between. So I hope that you enjoyed Module 1. Please reach out with any questions and look out for Module 2 coming soon. Thanks. Have a great day. If I can stop this.